Some moments force a nation to slow down, not because they are politically significant, but because they are human. Moments of loss, violence, and grief demand something simple and rare from those in power: restraint. This past weekend brought several such moments. Acts of violence across different parts of the world, lives ended suddenly, families left behind, communities searching for words that might make sense of the senseless. In times like these, leadership is not measured by policy announcements or public performance. It is measured by tone, by judgment, by the ability to recognize that certain moments are not about winning, responding, or retaliating, but about acknowledging pain. That is why what followed matters. Not because it was shocking, we have grown accustomed to shock, but because it revealed how easily empathy can be replaced by narrative, and how casually cruelty can be normalized when it comes from the highest office in the country. This is not a story about disagreement or ideology. It is a story about boundaries and what happens when they disappear. Because when a president speaks in moments of tragedy, the words do not belong only to him. They belong to the country he represents. And when those words fail to meet the moment, the damage travels far beyond a single post or a single day. To understand why this moment resonated so deeply, we need to be clear about what unfolded and why it crossed a line that should never be ambiguous. Over the course of a single weekend, multiple acts of violence shook public life. A deadly attack during a Hanukkah celebration abroad, a school shooting closer to home, and the murder of a prominent cultural figure and his spouse, lives taken, families shattered, questions left unanswered. These events are not connected by politics. They are connected by loss. In such moments, the role of a president is not to explain, reinterpret, or redirect. It is to acknowledge reality as it exists without embellishment or grievance. That expectation is not symbolic, it is functional. Public trust during moments of crisis depends on the belief that leaders understand the difference between disagreement and decency, between conflict and compassion. What followed instead was a public response that reframed tragedy as provocation. Grief became an opportunity for narrative. A violent death was repurposed into a political diagnosis, delivered without evidence and without restraint. This matters not because it offended critics, but because it altered the moral posture of the office itself. Words spoken by a president in the aftermath of violence do more than express opinion. They set a boundary for acceptable public behavior. They signal whether empathy is a shared value or a conditional one. When that boundary erodes, cruelty does not remain isolated. It becomes permission. And when permission comes from the top, the consequences are rarely contained to a single moment or a single target. This is why the response mattered, not as outrage, but as precedent. The presidency is not only a political role, it is a moral one. Long before policy is debated or laws are signed, the president functions as a symbolic figure, someone whose words, especially in moments of crisis, help set the emotional temperature of the nation. This is not a matter of preference. It is a function of the office. In moments of tragedy, presidents are expected to rise above personal grievance, ideological rivalry, and cultural conflict, not because they are asked to be perfect, but because restraint is part of the job description. Historically, this expectation has crossed party lines. Presidents have been judged, sometimes harshly, not just on what they did, but on how they spoke when the country was hurting. The reason is simple. Language shapes legitimacy. When a president responds to violence with empathy, it reinforces a sense of shared humanity. When that response is replaced with mockery, blame, or personal attack, it fractures that sense, especially among those already grieving. In this case, the response did not merely fail to console, it reinterpreted loss as ideological pathology, assigning motive and moral judgment without evidence, and doing so in a public forum where the power imbalance is absolute. That is not leadership under pressure. That is the exercise of power without restraint. What makes this especially consequential is not the insult itself, but the signal it sends, that compassion is conditional and dignity is granted only to those who align politically. Once that message is normalized, it reshapes public behavior. It teaches audiences that cruelty is not only acceptable, but justified, provided it serves the right narrative. This is how standards erode, not all at once, not dramatically, but quietly as each breach becomes easier to defend than the last. And when the presidency abandons its role as a stabilizing force, the cost is not measured in headlines. It is measured in trust, and trust, once lost, is difficult to restore. Language is never neutral when it comes from power, and when it comes from the presidency, it does not merely describe reality, it shapes it. What we saw in this moment was not a slip of the tongue or an emotional outburst. It was a deliberate choice to use language as a weapon at a time when restraint was required. By framing a violent death through the lens of political pathology, the response transformed grief into accusation. It replaced uncertainty with certainty and compassion with contempt. This matters because public language from leaders establishes norms. It tells people what is acceptable to say, when it is acceptable to say it, and who deserves protection from dehumanization. When the president uses tragedy as an opportunity to settle ideological scores, it sends a clear message. Suffering does not suspend conflict. It intensifies it. That message does not remain confined to the individual case. It seeps into public discourse, into media ecosystems, and into everyday interactions. It lowers the cost of cruelty. We also see, in the aftermath, a familiar pattern of deflection. Rather than reconsidering the response, it was repeated, defended, and reframed as honesty, as if cruelty were simply truth spoken plainly. This conflation of cruelty with authenticity is one of the most corrosive developments in modern political culture. It teaches audiences that empathy is performative while aggression is real, and over time this redefinition reshapes expectations. Leaders are no longer judged by their ability to unify in moments of crisis, but by their willingness to offend. The danger here is not emotional, it is structural. When leaders abandon the obligation to distinguish between private grievance and public responsibility, institutions lose their moderating function. The office becomes an extension of the individual rather than a restraint upon them. This is how political systems drift toward personalization of power. The consequences extend beyond rhetoric. When cruelty is normalized at the top, it weakens the informal checks that prevent escalation elsewhere. In public speech, in law enforcement culture, in political violence itself, empathy acts as a brake. Remove it, and momentum increases. This is why presidential language during moments of violence matters more than policy statements ever could. It either affirms a shared moral floor or signals that no such floor exists. In this case, the signal was unmistakable. The tragedy was not allowed to stand on its own. It was absorbed into a narrative of grievance, loyalty, and dominance. And when that becomes routine, cruelty stops being a failure of leadership. It becomes a governing style. When moments like this repeat, their impact compounds. Not because each one is uniquely shocking, but because they slowly recalibrate what the public comes to expect from leadership. Over time, standards shift. What once would have been disqualifying becomes controversial. What was controversial becomes routine, and what was routine becomes invisible. This is how democratic cultures erode, not through dramatic rupture, but through quiet accommodation. The normalization of cruelty has a particular effect on civic life. It discourages participation from those who feel unprotected by power. It rewards performative aggression over thoughtful restraint, and it teaches citizens that empathy is a liability rather than a virtue. In such an environment, politics becomes less about solving shared problems and more about asserting dominance. Language hardens. Institutions polarize. Trust dissolves. The cost is not abstract. When leadership fails to model restraint, it lowers expectations everywhere else, in media, in public debate, and in everyday interaction. The social contract weakens, replaced by perpetual conflict. And yet, moments like this also clarify responsibility. They remind us that democracy does not sustain itself automatically. It relies on norms that must be defended, especially when they are inconvenient. Decency is not weakness. Restraint is not surrender. And compassion, particularly in moments of loss, is not a political concession. It is a civic obligation. The question this moment leaves us with is not whether we agree politically. It is whether we accept a public culture where grief is conditional and dignity is negotiable. Because once those boundaries disappear, they are difficult to restore. Moments like this test more than political allegiance. They test whether we still recognize the difference between power and responsibility. The presidency does not require moral perfection, but it does require an understanding that some moments are not opportunities, they are obligations. Obligations to slow down, to acknowledge loss without qualification, to speak in a way that lowers the temperature rather than raises it. When those obligations are ignored, the damage extends beyond any single statement. It reshapes expectations. It teaches the public what kind of behavior will be defended, excused, or normalized. And once that lesson is absorbed, it is difficult to unlearn. This is why responses to tragedy matter so deeply. They reveal whether leadership still understands its role as a stabilizing force or whether it has surrendered that role to impulse and grievance. The events themselves will fade from the headlines, but the precedent will remain. Democracies are not undone by disagreement. They are weakened when basic standards of decency are treated as optional, especially by those entrusted with the most authority. The question left to us is not whether this moment was offensive or provocative. It is whether we are willing to insist that leadership, at minimum, meet the gravity of the moment it is speaking into. Because when cruelty replaces compassion at the highest level, the cost is paid not by politicians, but by the culture itself. Good night.